In the summer of AD 251, the thunder of hooves echoed along the Danube, where the fate of an empire teetered on the edge. Rome, proud and eternal, faced an enemy rising from the mists of the north, the Goths, fierce and unrelenting. At Abrittus, rain and swamp swallowed legions whole, and an emperor fell among his men. Never before had Rome endured such a blow. Yet within this tragedy, a question lingered. Could an empire built on conquest survive its darkest hour? Stay with us as we journey through betrayal, blood, and rebirth, where emperors fall, heroes rise, and Rome itself is tested like never before. If you hunger for epic tales of survival and empire, make sure to subscribe and follow this saga to its end. The summer of AD 251 was heavy with omens. From the northern forest came whispers of an unstoppable tide. The Goths, hardened by hunger and driven by ambition, pouring across the Danube like a storm. Rome's frontiers, stretched thin after years of unrest and plague, trembled at their approach. Yet to the citizens of the empire, the thought of defeat was unthinkable. Rome was eternal, Rome was invincible. The Danube frontier had stood for centuries, a steel wall against barbarian tide, and at its head now stood the emperor himself, Decius, proud, unyielding, and determined to prove that the gods still favored Rome. Decius carried with him more than just the standards of the legions. He bore the weight of tradition, the duty of emperors who had ruled since Augustus, and the desperate hope of a people haunted by famine and plague. To him, the Goths were not merely raiders. They were a scourge that dared challenge the majesty of Rome. He vowed not only to repel them, but to annihilate them, to remind the world that the eagle of Rome still soared above all. The armies gathered near the marshlands of Abrittus, in the province of Mercia. Heavy rains had soaked the earth, turning fields into swamps, the ground into a treacherous mire. Legionaries, clad in iron and discipline, marched with confidence, their scarlet banners cutting through the mist. Across the marsh, the Goths waited, tens of thousands, fierce in furs and leather, their eyes gleaming with the promise of plunder and glory. For them, this was not just a raid, but a reckoning. When the clash came, it was chaos. The sky thundered, rain poured, and the earth drank the blood of thousands. Roman shields locked in perfect ranks, pushing forward into the mire, while Gothic war cries pierced the storm. But the marsh betrayed Rome. Heavy armor dragged soldiers down. Formations dissolved in the sucking mud. Horses stumbled, standards fell, and panic rippled through the lines. Decius himself, armored in gleaming bronze, fought in the thick of it. To his soldiers, his presence was a beacon, an emperor who did not command from distant palaces, but bled beside them. Yet bravery could not undo the trap. The Goths, guided by cunning, had lured Rome into the marshlands deliberately. Their warriors struck from the flanks, surrounding the legions, cutting down those who struggled to rise from the mud. In the heart of the slaughter, tragedy struck. Decius's son, Herennius Etruscus, young and untested, fell beneath a rain of spears. The emperor, refusing to abandon his son, pressed deeper into the fray. Ancient chroniclers tell us his final words to the soldiers nearby: "Let no one mourn. The loss of one man is nothing to Rome." And then, with the fury of a last stand, he too was swallowed by the swamp and the blades of the Goths. Never before had such a thing happened. For centuries, emperors had fallen by assassination, intrigue, or civil war. But to die in open battle, slain by the hand of foreign enemies, that was unthinkable. The shock rippled like an earthquake. An emperor and his heir gone in a single day. Rome's armies shattered, their banners trampled into the mud. The Goths, victorious, swept over the Danube frontier with fire and sword. The field of Abrittus became a graveyard, not only for thousands of legionaries, but for Rome's pride itself. News of the disaster traveled like wildfire across the provinces. In marketplaces and temples, whispers rose. Had the gods abandoned Rome? Was the empire cursed, its glory waning, its destiny broken? For the first time, Rome was forced to look upon its own mortality. The eternal city had suffered defeats before, at Cannae, at Teutoburg, but always it had endured, always it had risen stronger. Yet this was different. This was the death of an emperor in the mud of a frontier marsh, at the hands of a people once dismissed as mere barbarians. The tragedy of Abrittus was not just a military defeat, it was a wound to the soul of Rome. The eagle standard, once untouchable, now seemed fragile. The empire's enemies had tasted imperial blood, and the scent would draw them ever closer. Rome had entered a new age, an age of crisis, of darkness, and of reckoning. And though the empire still stood, it now staggered, bleeding, uncertain if it could ever recover. From the mud of Abrittus rose not only the smoke of defeat, but also the whisper of survival. Among the scattered cohorts, where discipline had collapsed and despair threatened to consume all, one man still held his ground. His name was Gaius Aurelianus, a commander not yet burdened with high office, known to few outside the legions, but destined to become a flame in the empire's darkest night. Aurelianus had been forged on the frontiers. Born in humble Illyrian soil, he was no aristocrat of Rome's old senatorial class. He was a soldier's soldier, a man hardened by years of border skirmishes, who had risen not by birthright, but by merit and the respect of his men. In an empire where politics often outweighed valor, Aurelianus stood apart, fiercely loyal, relentless in discipline, and utterly unshaken by fear. On that day at Abrittus, as the thunder of Gothic horns drowned the cries of Roman officers, it was Aurelianus who gathered the broken fragments of the legions. With his own shield bloodied and dented, he cut a path through the marsh, rallying survivors. "Form ranks!" he roared above the storm, his voice carrying like iron across the chaos. In the eyes of soldiers drowning in panic, he was not just another officer, he was survival incarnate. Though the emperor lay dead, though the heir lay slain, Aurelianus refused to yield the field entirely. He knew that to collapse completely was to open the empire to utter ruin. With discipline rekindled, he carved a corridor through the mire, shepherding cohorts away from slaughter. What began as a rout turned into a grim retreat, bloody, desperate, but not annihilation. The Goths, drunk on victory, did not crush the last survivors entirely. Because of Aurelianus, Rome still had an army, battered though it was. When the remnants staggered back into Roman fortresses, the tale spread quickly. There had been one who did not break, one who had kept the eagle's standard from sinking forever into the marsh. Whispers of his name passed from soldier to soldier, campfire to campfire. In an empire starving for heroes, the image of a young general rallying men in the face of despair took root like a seed. Yet Aurelianus himself sought no glory from Abrittus. To him it had been a failure, an emperor lost, legions shattered, provinces imperiled. He wore the grief of that day like armor. Where others might have retreated into despair, he sharpened his will. His eyes, witnesses to imperial ruin, saw with ruthless clarity. Rome could no longer fight wars as it once had. The old methods had failed. The empire needed change, or it would perish. In the months that followed, as plague gnawed at cities and Gothic raiders burned villages across Moesia and Thrace, Aurelianus remained on the frontier. He drilled survivors into hardened companies, turned fugitives into disciplined soldiers, and struck back with quick raids of his own. Where the Senate hesitated, where provincial governors quarreled, Aurelianus acted. His name became synonymous with vigilance, an officer who never slept, who rode at the head of his cavalry, who struck like lightning and vanished into the night. The soldiers came to call him Manu ad Ferrum, hand on sword. They said he never walked unarmed, never relaxed, never ceased preparing for the next attack. To some, he seemed more machine than man, iron wrapped in flesh. But to his soldiers, weary and scarred, this relentlessness was salvation. They had lost their emperor. In Aurelianus, they found a leader who refused to abandon them. And yet destiny would not reveal itself in full for years. At Abrittus, Aurelianus had not become emperor, nor even commander of Rome's armies. He was still a young general, one name among many in a fractured empire. But in the eyes of history, that day had marked him. He had seen Rome's weakness unveiled. He had seen what it meant when the old certainties collapsed, and he had resolved in the silent chambers of his soul that Rome would not die, not while he lived. Ancient chroniclers tell us that after Abrittus, when others wept for Decius. Aurelianus's only words were, "Rome must endure." Simple, stark, and unwavering. It was not a boast, but a vow. For now his flame burned quietly, hidden beneath the greater turmoil of emperors rising and falling, of crises spreading from frontier to frontier. But like a sword left in the forge, he was being tempered. The empire did not yet know it, but within this young Illyrian lay the iron will that would one day steer Rome through the storm. Thus from tragedy emerged a figure of resilience. Abrittus was remembered as the graveyard of emperors, but also as the crucible that revealed a soldier who refused to let Rome's flame be extinguished. In the long night of the 3rd century, when darkness pressed hard upon the empire, the memory of Aurelianus's defiance stood as proof. Even when emperors fell, Rome could still produce men strong enough to carry its burden forward, and in that truth lay the faintest glimmer of hope. The field of Abrittus had swallowed more than an emperor. It had consumed the illusion of Roman invincibility. In its wake, the empire staggered like a wounded beast, bleeding from wounds too many to count. Across the provinces, fear took root, and whispers rose in every forum and marketplace. Perhaps Rome was no longer eternal. The first blow came from within. The plague, which had stalked the empire for years, flared again. Cities already weakened by war now groaned beneath the weight of disease. Streets echoed with the cries of the dying. Temples overflowed with supplicants begging the gods for mercy. Yet the smoke of sacrifices seemed to rise into silence. Priests muttered darkly that the gods had turned their faces away, that the empire's sins had poisoned the favor of heaven. Then came famine. With farms abandoned, with raiders burning fields along the Danube and Thrace, grain became scarce. Prices soared, bread lines lengthened, and in the slums of Rome itself, riots erupted. The Senate, once the proud guardian of order, bickered and faltered, more concerned with intrigue than with the starving masses. Governors in far provinces acted like kings, hoarding supplies, raising private militias, caring little for the authority of emperors who seemed to fall as quickly as they rose. For Rome's throne had become a perilous seat. Decius was dead, and in his place rose Trebonianus Gallus, hailed emperor by the army in the aftermath of Abrittus. Yet his reign began not with triumph, but with desperation. To buy peace with the Goths, he agreed to humiliating terms, tribute paid to the very barbarians who had slain his predecessor. To the people of Rome, this was salt poured into an open wound. Their emperor had become a payer of ransom, not a conqueror. And while Gallus struggled to hold the center, the edges of the empire unraveled. Along the Rhine, Germanic tribes pressed harder than ever. In the east, the Persians, under the great king Shapur, tested Rome's defenses, striking deep into Syria. Each frontier seemed to blaze with fire, and Rome no longer had the strength to smother them all. Within, the fabric of loyalty tore apart. Ambitious generals, seeing Gallus weakened, dreamed of purple robes for themselves. Armies proclaimed their commanders emperors, plunging provinces into civil war. Brothers in arms turned swords against one another, while Rome's enemies laughed at the spectacle. An empire once bound by discipline and unity now devoured itself with rivalry and mistrust. To the common citizen, it seemed as though the very order of the world had collapsed. The gods no longer answered prayers. Emperors no longer ruled with certainty, but fell like autumn leaves. The legions no longer marched as protectors, but as threats, their loyalties for sale to the highest bidder. The eternal city trembled, its marble walls hiding a heart that beat with fear. In this chaos, even the old Roman virtues, pietas, disciplina, seemed hollow. Soldiers deserted. Provinces muttered about secession. The Danube frontier, once shield and sword, had become a gaping wound through which barbarian raids poured like floodwaters. Yet perhaps the gravest wound was not of body, but of spirit. The death of Decius at the hands of foreign warriors had struck a blow to the Roman psyche. Never before had an emperor fallen thus. To many it was proof that Rome was no longer chosen by fate, no longer guided by destiny. What was the empire if not the will of the gods made manifest? And if that divine will had faltered, then what remained but ruin? Chroniclers of the age describe a people haunted by doubt. In marketplaces, old men spoke of the glory of Augustus and Trajan, of days when the empire's shadow stretched to the edges of the known world. Women wept as Gothic raiders carried off children from frontier villages. Soldiers cursed their paymasters as wages failed to come. And through it all spread the gnawing fear. Perhaps the empire was in its twilight. Perhaps Rome's story was nearing its end. The Senate, toothless and divided, offered little guidance. Its orators thundered about restoring tradition, but their words carried no power beyond the walls of the Curia. Real authority lay with the armies, and the armies were restless, hungry, and disillusioned. Thus the empire entered what later generations would call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was a storm of plague, famine, invasion, and usurpation, battering Rome from every side. Each year brought new emperors, new pretenders, new betrayals. None seemed able to hold the empire together for long, and yet, amid this whirlwind, the embers of resilience remained. Though provinces faltered, though emperors fell, the Roman spirit did not vanish entirely. And in the ranks of the legions, in the hearts of frontier commanders, there still lingered a stubborn belief that Rome was worth saving, that the eagle standard must not be allowed to fall. Among these embers, one name began to flicker more brightly. Gallienus, the son of Gallus's successor, a man destined to grasp the reins when all else seemed lost. But for now the empire writhed in turmoil, its wounds raw and bleeding, its future uncertain. Rome had faced crises before. Hannibal had marched to her gates, Spartacus had shaken her fields, the Teutoburg forest had claimed her legions. Each time she had endured. But the crisis after Abrittus was different. This was not one enemy, not one battle, but the slow unmaking of an empire. The question was no longer whether Rome could win a war. The question was whether Rome could survive itself. To understand the terror of the mid-3rd century, one must look beyond Rome's crumbling walls and peer into the forests of the north, where a people once dismissed as mere marauders were rising to become a true adversary. The Goths, whose thunderous charge had shattered Decius at Abrittus, were no longer content with plunder alone. They were becoming something greater, an enemy capable of rivaling the empire itself. For generations, Roman writers had spoken of the Goths as shadows beyond the Danube, wild, fierce, and uncivilized. They were hunters and raiders, clothed in furs, dwelling in wooden halls, worshippers of gods strange to Roman ears. Yet war with Rome had changed them. Each clash, each raid, each treaty had been a lesson. They watched Rome closely. They learned how the legions fought, how Roman cavalry maneuvered, how siege engines battered walls. Slowly, the Goths began to adopt what they saw, molding themselves into something more dangerous than the Romans imagined. By the mid-3rd century, Gothic warbands no longer came as scattered raiders, but as great coalitions. Chieftains once divided by blood feuds now bound themselves together under the promise of richer prizes across the frontier. With shared councils and common campaigns, they forged a unity that Rome had never expected. And at their head stood kings like Geneva, whose cunning had already bested emperors, whose strategies proved that the Goths were no longer barbarians, stumbling into battle but commanders of deliberate design. Their armies were a terrifying sight, tens of thousands strong, a tide of warriors on foot and horseback. They wore a patchwork of armor, some their own, others looted from fallen legionaries. Their swords and spears glinted with Roman steel, trophies of countless raids. Standards flew above their ranks, crude but defiant, symbols of a people awakening to destiny. They were no longer content to harry the edges of empire. They dreamed of conquest, of carving realms from Rome's flesh. The Balkans felt the weight of this storm first. Gothic raiders poured across the Danube, torching villages, enslaving thousands, dragging wealth back into their forest strongholds. Cities that had once thrived under Roman law now burned in the night. Along the Black Sea, Gothic ships, built with Roman designs captured from coastal ports, sailed boldly, striking at towns that had never known barbarian sails before. Even the rich cities of Asia Minor trembled as Gothic fleets plundered their coasts. Fear became their greatest weapon. Stories spread faster than armies, of villages slaughtered to the last child, of captives dragged in chains, of Roman governors slain before their temples. Panic gripped the provinces. Farmers abandoned their fields, towns barred their gates, and the once prosperous Danubian frontier emptied into a desolation. But perhaps most chilling was the Gothic ability to adapt. Where once they had been dismissed as crude fighters, they now besieged fortified towns with engines taken from Roman arsenals. They wielded cavalry with growing skill, striking not just with brute force, but with maneuvers borrowed from their foes. Each battle against Rome honed their edge sharper. Rome's enemies were no longer strangers at the gate. They were students who had learned too much. Chroniclers describe them with awe and dread, a people who moved like storm clouds, who seemed born for war, who lived not in marble cities but in the saddle, with hunger and ambition as their only masters. And unlike Rome, fractured by civil wars and rival emperors, the Goths fought with a single purpose. Their dream was not abstract empire, but immediate survival and gain, clear and binding. For Rome, this was the nightmare realized, that the barbarians were no longer simply raiders, but rivals. Every raid was a wound, every victory a lesson, every treaty a foothold for greater power. What had begun as border skirmishes was evolving into a clash of civilizations. To the people of the Balkans, the Goths were not distant adversaries, but an ever-present terror. Smoke on the horizon meant another wave was coming. The cries of captives echoed in the night, and from every province came the same grim conclusion. Rome could no longer protect her children. The empire's great promise, that the Pax Romana stretched to the farthest village, was unraveling beneath Gothic fury. Yet for the Goths, this was only the beginning. Each victory emboldened them further. The death of Decius had been more than triumph. It was a sign. If an emperor could fall, then what was left of Rome's sacred aura? The Goths, once awed by the might of legions, now saw themselves as equals, even superiors. They no longer asked whether Rome could be beaten, they asked how much of Rome could be theirs. In this crucible, the Goths transformed from raiders into a people with destiny. They would not yet build kingdoms of permanence, that time lay still in the future, but their campaigns of the mid-3rd century announced a chilling truth. Rome's enemies were learning faster than Rome could adapt. The balance of fear had shifted. No longer did the legions march with unquestioned supremacy. Now it was Rome who trembled at the thought of invasion, Rome who paid tribute to keep enemies at bay, Rome who whispered that the age of invulnerability was over. And yet amid the terror, something stirred within the empire. For if the Goths had become adversaries worthy of dread, then they had also become adversaries worthy of respect. And Rome had always risen highest when faced with worthy foes. In the crucible of Gothic fury, the empire would either find new strength or collapse into ashes. The storm was at its height. But storms pass, and Rome still had warriors who would not yield. The empire bled, but it did not perish. In the decades of crisis that followed Abrittus, emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, many slain by their own soldiers before they ever set foot in the eternal city. Yet from the maelstrom emerged a figure who, against every storm, refused to let Rome collapse entirely. His name was Gallienus, and though history has often remembered him with faint praise, in truth he was among the men who saved the empire from extinction. Gallienus was the son of Valerian, an older emperor whose reign had begun with hope, but soon descended into catastrophe. Valerian marched east to confront the Persians and was captured alive by King Shapur, a humiliation without equal in Rome's long story. The emperor of the world, paraded in chains before foreign kings, reduced to a trophy. The East despaired, the Senate despaired, but Gallienus, who had already been named co-emperor, did not. With his father lost, Gallienus stood alone at the helm of an empire besieged. To the north, the Goths surged across the Danube. To the west, Alemanni tribes ravaged Gaul and even threatened Italy itself. To the east, Persians carved deep into Roman Syria. Within, generals proclaimed themselves emperors, carving provinces into splinter states. Famine gnawed at the people, plague thinned the legions, and treachery festered everywhere. Many would have broken under such weight. Gallienus did not. Though not a man of senatorial pedigree, Gallienus possessed a clear, pragmatic vision. He understood a truth that many of his predecessors had refused to see. Rome could no longer rely on the old ways of war. The static legions stationed along the frontiers, mighty in their day, had become too rigid, too slow, too vulnerable to the lightning raids of enemies who struck and vanished before the legions could respond. To save the empire, war itself had to change. Gallienus's genius lay not in grand speeches or theatrical gestures, but in reform. He began to reshape the Roman army into a tool fit for survival. First, he created a new corps of mobile cavalry, drawn from the best riders of Illyria and Thrace. These horsemen could move swiftly across provinces, striking at raiders before they could melt away. They became the emperor's sword, able to meet the Goths on their own terms, speed against speed, maneuver against maneuver. This was revolutionary. For centuries, the legions had been Rome's pride. The infantry, disciplined and unbreakable, the shield wall that conquered the world. But Gallienus knew that in this new age, cavalry would decide Rome's fate. By elevating them, he laid the foundation for the empire's survival. Nor did he stop there. He restructured command, elevating equestrian officers, men of skill rather than noble birth, over the old senatorial elite. This angered the Senate, which saw its ancient privileges slipping away. But Gallienus cared little for their protests. He was a soldier's emperor, not a senator's puppet. Merit, not lineage, would decide who commanded in Rome's armies. He also hardened the empire's defenses, reinforcing key cities, building supply networks, ensuring that provinces could hold out under siege. No longer would a single lost battle doom entire regions. Gallienus sought resilience, the ability to absorb blows and recover, to bend but not break. And above all, he fought, not from palaces or distant camps, but at the front. Chroniclers describe him as tireless, riding with his cavalry across the Alps to face the Alemanni, then rushing east to confront Gothic raids, then turning west again to suppress revolts. He became a whirlwind, always moving, always present, the one figure who seemed unbroken amid the chaos. In battle, Gallienus proved his mettle. When the Alemanni poured across the Alps into Italy, threatening even Rome herself, panic seized the people. But Gallienus rode to meet them, his cavalry striking with ferocity. At the Battle of Milan, he crushed them, driving them back beyond the frontiers. It was a victory not just of arms but of spirit. For the first time in years, Rome had struck back decisively. When the Goths once again swarmed across the Danube, Gallienus's reformed cavalry met them with equal speed. Skirmish after skirmish, raid after raid, the tide was blunted. The Balkans bled, yes, but they did not collapse. Each victory, however small, restored a fragment of confidence. The empire still had teeth. Even within the turmoil of rebellion, Gallienus held firm. When Postumus, a general in Gaul, declared himself emperor and carved out the so-called Gallic Empire, many thought the West was lost forever. Gallienus attempted to retake it, but though he failed to reunite the empire immediately, he did not let despair consume him. Instead, he tightened his grip on the heartlands, ensuring that Italy and the Balkans remained Roman. He refused to surrender the core, no matter how much crumbled at the edges. To his enemies, Gallienus seemed an iron figure, unyielding, relentless, impossible to topple. To his soldiers, he was both commander and savior, the man who gave them tools to fight, the leader who never abandoned them. To the Senate, however, he was a usurper of their old privileges, and their whispers would one day prove fatal. Yet history cannot deny what he achieved. For under Gallienus, Rome began to breathe again. His cavalry reforms endured long after his death, forming the backbone of later emperors' armies. His insistence on merit over birth allowed men like Claudius Gothicus and Aurelian, commanders of true ability, to rise. His resilience, his refusal to yield even when surrounded by fire on all sides, kept the empire alive when collapse seemed inevitable. In Gallienus, the empire found not a conqueror of lands, but a preserver of existence. He did not expand borders, he did not leave behind triumphal arches proclaiming vast victories, but he saved Rome from the abyss. He proved that even in the blackest night, leadership could kindle embers of survival. The historian Aurelius Victor wrote that Gallienus held together a crumbling world. That is perhaps the truest measure of his legacy. He was not the hammer of enemies, nor the bringer of golden ages, but the shield that endured when all else shattered. Thus, from the ashes of Abrittus and the storm of crisis, Rome found a shepherd of renewal. Gallienus's reign was proof that the empire, though shaken, still had leaders who could adapt, who could fight, who could breathe life into dying embers. He would not be the last, for soon another would rise, hardened by frontier wars, tempered by loss, destined to take Rome's battered legions and forge them once more into the sword of empire. The name of Aurelian waited in the wings, but without Gallienus, there might never have been an empire left for him to save. Rome had bent, Rome had bled, but Rome had not yet broken. From the furnace of disaster, Rome had found a fragile rhythm of survival. Gallienus had reshaped the army, defended Italy, and taught the empire to bend without breaking. Yet survival alone was not enough. Rome was not a kingdom meant merely to endure. It was an empire born to dominate, to strike back, to reclaim what was lost. The moment was coming when defense would give way to resurrection, and that moment arrived with the rise of Aurelian. Aurelian was not born of patrician blood, nor polished in the marble halls of the Senate. He was a soldier, bred in the hard soil of the Balkans, where frontier wars carved men into steel. Known among comrades as Manu ad Ferrum, hand on the sword, Aurelian was a commander whose very presence on the battlefield carried the weight of inevitability. He had fought under Gallienus, risen through merit, and when his turn came, he embodied the spirit of Rome's rebirth. The empire he inherited was fractured. To the west, Postumus's Gallic Empire still ruled Gaul, Spain, and Britain, its legions loyal to a rival purple. To the east, the jewel of Palmyra under Queen Zenobia had risen in near independence, controlling Syria, Egypt, and the trade arteries of the east. The empire was no longer whole. It was a broken mosaic, its fragments glittering but divided. Many doubted Rome would ever unite again. Aurelian silenced their doubts with action. First, he turned against the Alemanni, who had once threatened the very heart of Italy. Swift as lightning, he marched to confront them. At the Battle of Fano, near the Adriatic coast, his legions clashed with barbarian warriors who believed Rome weak and broken. Aurelian shattered them, driving their remnants north in disarray. When the Alemanni tried to regroup, Aurelian crushed them again at Pavia. The roads to Rome were secured, Italy was saved, and once more the eternal city breathed free air without the stench of invaders at its gates. But Aurelian did more than win battles. He rebuilt the empire's confidence. He ordered the construction of the Aurelian walls, massive fortifications encircling Rome itself. For centuries, the capital had stood undefended, trusting in the reach of its legions. But Aurelian, seasoned by decades of chaos, knew better. With walls of stone rising around her, Rome became not only the heart of empire, but a fortress capable of weathering any storm. Then came the task of reunification. To the east, Zenobia of Palmyra ruled as though queen of a new empire. Charismatic, intelligent, and ambitious, she expanded her realm across Egypt and Anatolia, threatening to supplant Rome itself. Many eastern provinces welcomed her, weary of Rome's weakness, drawn to the splendor of Palmyra's caravan wealth. But Aurelian would not accept the loss of the east. In a campaign of relentless speed, he swept through Anatolia, forcing one city after another to bend the knee. At Emesa, and finally at Palmyra itself, his legions crushed Zenobia's armies. The queen, once draped in royal majesty, was captured and paraded in chains, a stark reminder that Rome, though wounded, was still master of the world. The victory over Palmyra was not merely military, it was psychological. The East, long tempted to slip away, was reminded of the empire's iron hand. Grain once more flowed from Egypt to feed Rome. Trade routes revived, and the provinces, though weary, accepted their place beneath the eagle. But Aurelian was not finished. His gaze turned westward, where the Gallic Empire still stood defiant. Postumus was gone, but his successors held sway over the Rhine legions, confident in their autonomy. Yet they underestimated the man now marching toward them. In 274, at the Battle of Chalons, Aurelian's legions met the Gallic forces in a contest that would decide the empire's unity. The battle was fierce, with cavalry charges thundering across fields stained in blood. But Aurelian's discipline, his reformed armies, and his sheer will prevailed. The Gallic Empire collapsed, its provinces reintegrated into Rome. For the first time in half a century, the empire was whole again. From Britain to Egypt, from the Rhine to the Euphrates, the eagle's wings once more spanned the horizon. It was not merely conquest that Aurelian brought, it was revival. He reformed the coinage, stabilizing Rome's shattered economy. He restored faith in the sun cult, proclaiming Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, as a symbol of Rome's eternal endurance. And above all, he rekindled belief that Rome, though scarred, was immortal. The chronicler Vopiscus wrote of Aurelian, "He restored the world entire." Indeed, in his brief but blazing reign, Aurelian became the architect of resurrection. He took the broken fragments Gallienus had preserved and forged them back into a whole. He gave Rome back her dignity, her confidence, her unity. Yet even in triumph, shadows lingered. Assassins, fearful of his growing power, struck him down before his dreams could be fully realized. The empire mourned, for in Aurelian it had glimpsed what renewal truly meant. Still, his legacy endured. Others would falter, others would rise, but the empire he reforged would stand for another 2 centuries. The story of Rome in this age is not one of unbroken glory, but of survival through ruin, of rebirth through suffering. At Abrittus, the empire had seemed doomed. Under Gallienus, it learned resilience. Under Aurelian, it tasted resurrection. And so, even in the darkest nights of history, Rome proved its truth. The empire may bend, the empire may bleed, but the empire does not break.